Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on global sexuality. Broadly speaking, conceptualizing sexualities in the global context requires an understanding of two often opposing forces, the local and the global. It is quite common for religious and political leaders, as well as other social commentators in non-Western countries, to suggest that the existence of queer people in these countries is a direct result of Western influence generally and the process of colonization and globalization specifically. Ironically, this rejection of queer people as Western and colonial is almost always contextualized within a Christian framework. It also ignores the fact that same-sex sex and sex gender diverse people have existed in every culture throughout the world, even in pre-colonial societies. As we have explored throughout this unit, the term globalization here refers to the manner in which societies have become more and more internet connected due to the rapid changes in electronic communication and transport. So we've seen in this unit that globalization isn't necessarily a new concept. Humans have always had that interconnection with other humans across the globe. We've seen many examples of that. But what is unique about contemporary globalization is the speed at which it is happening. The fact that, electronic communication and transport has led to such a change in our capacity to interact. In terms of cultural globalization, there is an emphasis in the way in which cultural aspects, specifically cultural aspects, such as the way we speak, eat, dress, and the way we identify ourselves, is influenced by societies across the globe. Holmes here refers to cultural globalization as there are two primary senses of cultural globalization. First refers to the increasing mixing and intermingling of centers of cultural diversity, language, cult, religion, customs, music. The main agents of cultural globalization are migration, commodity exchange, global media, tourism, and telecommunication. And the second is the globalization of the capitalist culture, which we'll come back to. The fear of many non-Western countries is that they would not just become more Western, but more like the United States or America. And this is distinct from globalization and referred to as Americanization. So Van Krijken refers to Americanization as through a process, or Americanization occurs through a process of progressive modernization in which each locality becomes progressively modernized under the relentless force of American cultural imperialism. As locations become more modernized, they move up the modernity hierarchy. Each movement towards complete modernization inches a locality one step closer to ultimate realization of a global America. As such, Americanization is strongly equated with modernization and globalization. So it's almost like this expectation, this modernization is equated with a singular culture, and this singular culture being an American culture. An example of Americanization, we can see that even when you are writing your essays and you open up a Microsoft Word document to write an essay, you'll see that the American spelling setting is the default setting. And if you ever go to try to change the American spelling setting to an Australian setting, you'll find that it often defaults back to the American spelling. So it's really subtle. It's also about Microsoft being really insidious, but also the Americanization of Australian culture can be seen through something simple as changing of spelling. So on the one hand, in terms of sexuality, this is taking place in both modern and non-Western cultures. Throughout the world, localized queer culture has been influenced by queer historical events, popular culture phenomenon, and symbols that are or were specific just to the United States. So we can think of things such as the Stonewall riot-ins in 1969, which are often expressed in terms of being the founding of the gay rights movement. which is just not true, because what we refer to the gay rights movement has existed prior to the Stonewall Rights 1969 and existed in other countries other than the United States of America. For example, in England and here in Australia, what was to be called the gay rights movement was already flourishing. So, but the iconography of the Stonewall Ride-In has become such a mythology that has dominated a worldview of the gay rights movement. We can think of popular culture phenomena such as RuPaul's Drag Race, which over the last 10, 15 years, has just become an immense international success. And these very specific North American cultural traditions around drag have now been transmitted into other countries. And a lot of that language is now being incorporated into international language around drag. Symbols such as the rainbow flag similarly have become universally recognized across the world, even though that in particular did emerge also in the United States of America. So we can see that there are these examples of Americanization. So while queer people will know about the Stonewall riots that took place in New York, very few people would know about other work in activism, such as the sexology movement in the 1800s and the early 1900s, especially in Europe. Rarely will people also know that the sexology movement also led to the decriminalization of homosexuality in Germany just before the takeover of Nazism in the 1930s. So while these very American examples are probably well known, other examples such as in Europe, because they were decimated by World War II, have been largely ignored. So there is a case to be made that there is an Americanization of queer culture. In Global Gaze, Australian academic and gay rights activist Dennis Altman posits that the gay worlds of Bangkok, Jakarta, Hong Kong, Manila, and Seoul are obviously different from those of Budapest, Johannesburg, Hobart, Minneapolis, and Sao Paulo. Yet in all these cities, covering all continents and both the developed and the developing countries, there are similarities which seem important. However, Altman also goes on to say that these similarities have more to do with the common urban and ideological pressures than they do with cultural backgrounds. So Altman is saying a few things here with these two quotes, that although there are local distinctions of queer culture across the world, there are the obvious similarities in terms of how those queer communities, are expressing themselves. They're using language, they're using symbols, they're using history, mythology from the United States to bolster their own identities. So there are these similarities which are emerging. Altman is saying, though, that those similarities come more from this urban development, the urbanization, the intensity of living in cities, inner city relationships, inner city structures, inner city social relationships, and ideological pressures than they do from cultural backgrounds. So it's more not necessarily to do with one's sexuality, but broader patterns of urbanization and globalization. So, in other words, any similarities between so-called gay cultures in different parts of the world is more to do with globalization, urbanization, modernization, and not necessarily an indication that sexual identities, histories, cultures of non-Western countries are the same to those in Western countries. So while you may, as an observer, a Western observer going into non-Western countries, see the rainbow flag, see words like gay, see just celebrations of Stonewall Ride-Ins, among many others, or RuPaul's Drag Race, that doesn't mean that the local sexualities are the same. While these iconographies, these symbols may be reproduced and used, their underlying local identities are not necessarily the same. Research on global sexuality has reinforced the idea that Western or American sexual identities, such as gay, lesbian, have not replaced or even silenced local sexual identities. Altman also argues that not only are these Western sexualities the minority in these non-Western societies, but localized and indigenous sexualities are less likely to mobilize or come together as a community under Western sexual identities, histories, and cultures. Many same-sex sexualities in non-Western countries not only maintain their own identities, but unique socio-cultural meaning associated with them that cannot be translated into Western concepts of gay and lesbian. We saw this in a previous lecture when we talked about the Two-Spirit people in North America, and we talked about the Hijra in India and sister girls and brother boys here in Australia when we talk about gender. But this also is similar to sexuality. Australian academic Peter A. Jackson, not to be confused with the director of Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson, argues that it is too simplistic to assume that terms such as gay, lesbian, transgender can be easily translated into non-Western cultures. So this is especially true when it comes to cultures that do not necessarily make a distinction between sex, gender, and sexuality. For example, the term Kathui in Thailand can refer to both sex, gender, and sexuality. So while there are observations that processes of globalization, Americanization are leading to the adoption of particularly United States of American identities, symbols, mythologies, that doesn't necessarily mean that the localized identities, histories, cultures are being replaced, silenced. Research actually says this is just not happening at all. While it may appear to be on the surface, but to an outside observer, but researchers said that this is not necessarily the case. In fact, this is often done and reinforced because terms such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender don't translate into localized communities in non-Western countries. Last slide for the semester as well. So understanding global sexuality needs to be done in the context of globalization. Western American forces of cultural modernization are present. Many non-Western countries maintain their original identities and communities nonetheless. Moreover, these non-Western examples of unique sexuality are celebrated as non-Western and not equivalent to Western concepts. 3 key terms, 2 key authors from this topic.